Welcome back to Religion to Reality, and happy Columbus Day, happy Indigenous Peoples Day to all of you. Thanks for joining us today. Our goal today and always in this webinar series is to inspire and inform you so that you might connect with those you serve and others who also serve in ministry. We hope that you come away today with some key insights that allow you to improve the effectiveness of your ministry by relying on the data rather than just hunches. In particular, we're hoping to support you in building your ministry and helping those you serve lead an integrated life by decompartmentalizing their spiritual journey. In fact, that's why we call this Religion to Reality. Through all of the webinars in this series, we're going to be interactively discussing what it means to live an integrated life, where we're not just obligated to go to church on Sundays, but we actually live our faith in each part of our life, internally and externally. This is what transforms religion from a responsibility or a social club into reality, every part of our lives. I also just want to call out that there is a Q&A button here in the Zoom interface that allows you to ask questions at any time. So please do. We'll answer as many as we can, probably mostly at the end during our Q&A discussion. Before we go any further, I would just like to ask Father John here to lead us in a prayer from St. Francis de Sales.
So we'll just put ourselves in God's presence. Do not look forward in fear to the changes and chances of this life. Rather, look to them with full confidence that as they arise, God to whom you belong will, in his love, enable you to profit by them. He has guided you thus far in life, and he will lead you safely through all trials. And when you cannot stand it, God will carry you in his arms. Do not fear what may happen tomorrow. The same everlasting Father who cares for you today will take care of you then and every day. He will either shield you from suffering or will give you unfailing strength to bear it. Be at peace, then, and put aside all anxious thoughts and imaginations. Amen. In the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Amen.
All right. So today's topic is on spiritual direction. And we're defining it this way. The spiritual direction is a confidential, ongoing, committed conversation with a trained spiritual director that helps a person grow in their relationship with God. It is an intentional and ordered action that seeks to discover what God is doing in a person's life and to help that person become the very presence of Christ in the world. So before we get started, we like to make these things interactive. So I'd like to bring up our first poll. Nick, could you help with that? What I want to know is, are you currently receiving spiritual direction or have ever received spiritual direction? So your options are, yes, you're currently receiving spiritual direction. Yes, you in the past you have received it, but not currently, or no, I have never received spiritual direction. These answers are totally anonymous, so please be honest. There's no right or wrong answer. We just want to get a sense of where you guys are, and that helps us kind of make a little comparison to this to the answers to the study that we conducted. So if those answers are locked in, then I want to ask one more question. So our second poll is spiritual direction available in your home parish or any faith community to which you belong? So Nick, could you please, thank you. And the answers, of course, are just yes, no, or I don't know. And if you don't know, that's totally fine. Like I said, it's all anonymous. Please be honest. Just wondering if spiritual direction is available in kind of the circles that you run in, so to speak. And if everybody's locked in, then I think we can continue on. So our agenda for the day is that I'll introduce our speakers here. We'll go over some initial findings from the study. We'll go over new findings from the study, and there'll be some discussion throughout there. I'll signpost what's coming next, and then there's an appendix, which really only matters for those of you who download this deck later. It will be made available for download, as well as the recording will be available afterwards. So you can find that stuff. All the stuff we didn't get to today, you can find it there. So without further ado, here are our speakers for today. We are joined by Father Boniface Hicks and Dr. Greg Popcak. So Father Boniface Hicks is a Benedictine monk of St. Vincent Archabbey in Latrobe, Pennsylvania. He entered the monastery in 1998 and was ordained a priest in 2004. He has provided spiritual direction for many men and women, including married couples, seminarians, consecrated religious, and priests. He completed a PhD in computer science from Penn State University and a licentiate in sacred theology from the Angelicum. He is an on-air contributor for We Are One Body Catholic Radio and has recorded thousands of radio programs on theology and the spiritual life. He has extensive experience as a retreat master for laity, consecrated religious, and clergy. He serves St. Vincent Seminary as the director for spiritual formation and as the director of the Institute for Ministry Formation. He authored the books Through the Heart of St. Joseph, The Fruit of Her Womb, and The Hidden Power of Silence in the Mass, a guide for encountering Christ in the liturgy, and co-authored along with Father Thomas Acklin, OSB, the books Spiritual Direction, a guide for sharing the Father's love, and Personal Prayer, a guide for receiving the Father's love. Welcome, Father Boniface.
Great to be happy to have been invited.
And we also have Dr. Greg Popcak here, who is the founder and director of CatholicCounselors.com, a group pastoral telecounseling practice that conducts over 30,000 sessions a year with Catholic individuals, couples, and families around the world. He has also been an instructor in spiritual direction. Together with his wife, Lisa, he is the author of over 20 books integrating insights from counseling psychology with the timeless wisdom of our Catholic faith. He and Lisa also co-host More to Life, a call-in theology of the body-based advice program that airs Monday through Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio, Sirius XM 130. Dr. Greg, so great to have you. Thanks for being here with us.
Thank you. Pleasure.
As always, your co-hosts are Father John Gribowich here, who is a high school instructor of theology and director of curriculum at Sunday to Sunday, and myself, Dave Plisky. I'm the director of product innovation at Sales Media. If you want our full lengthy bios, check out episode 1 where we get into it. But instead, I'd really just like to continue on here. So, all right. Let's get into our initial findings. So this is all from the study on discipleship that we conducted in 2021 and whose overall report we released in 2022. As in the first webinar, I don't expect you to take in all of the data on each of these slides. They're packed with findings from the study, but we're only going to be focusing on certain aspects of the data. So I will guide you around with a little laser pointer. In fact, let me just turn this into a laser pointer here. And let me just make it a better color for all of us to see that. All right, here we go. I'm also eschewing the usual 3 words on a slide best practice for presentations and keeping everything on the slides so that what you see here is exactly the deck that will be distributed afterwards and available to download for free. So without further ado, here are some of the data that we have learned. So over half of respondents, so you can see here, 53% had experience with spiritual direction, but only 20%, 1 in 5, are currently engaged in it. Only 4 in 10, this 40%, know that spiritual direction is available nearby, which indicates to us a heightened need for visibility and availability. Nick, let's pull up the results from the first poll and see how people compared to what we found in the study. All right, so of people on our webinar here, it looks like 41% are currently receiving it, 41% used to receive it, and 18% have never received spiritual direction. Okay, so a little bit more spiritual direction focus, which of course makes sense. It's what you're here for. So that's great to see. It's great to see how many people are taking advantage of this wonderful thing. Now let's take a look at the results from the second poll, which correspond to this other aspect of this chart here. Okay, is spiritual direction available in your home? So 30% of you said yes, 40% said no, 30% are not sure. You know, this is not surprising to me, and I think that everyone here will agree. I want to throw a couple more insights on the board here, and then we'll discuss. So we figured that plenty of people would not be receiving spiritual direction, despite that all respondents are, you know, regular mass attending Catholics. That was one of the, and again, if you want to know more about the study, please just take a look at the first webinar. But what we found, so we asked, what are the reasons for not receiving it if you're in fact not? And these answers are divided between in two columns here between those who have received spiritual direction in the past and are no longer, and those who have not. And either way, the top response was, I don't know how to find a spiritual director. I don't know how to find someone for spiritual direction. And among those who have not received spiritual direction in the past, the second most likely answer was, I do not really understand spiritual direction. So there's clearly an availability, difficult to find sort of thing happening, and just non-awareness of what this exactly is. And finally, we asked about likelihood of receiving online spiritual direction. And so what we found was that pretty much across the board, people were open to it, but it was those who have never received spiritual direction who were most open to doing online spiritual direction. They said that they were at least somewhat, if not extremely likely, to do online spiritual direction. That was over half of respondents who had never received it. So I want to ask the same thing of our audience here. For you guys, Nick, could we pull up poll number 3? If online spiritual direction were readily available, online spiritual direction, what is the likelihood that you would sign up for it? I know this looks like a lot of answers. If you already received spiritual direction, just look at the bottom two there, that you either already have an online spiritual director or you already have an in-person spiritual director. If you don't have a spiritual director right now, the first 6 answers are just different likelihoods that you would consider doing it. So, yeah, I would like to know. And once that is kind of locked in, then we can move on. And actually, while people are finishing that, I'm just going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen for a minute and turn to you guys. What do you guys think? What do you guys make of these findings so far? What do you think?
No, I mean, can we put those slides back up, Dave? Is that all right?
Yeah.
That'd be great.
Which one are you looking for?
The one that I think you just had up, maybe.
Yeah.
I think that the issue that I've repeatedly have heard about spiritual direction is that either someone doesn't know that it exists, or secondly, if they do know about it, they don't really know where to go to get it. And if they make the connection of spiritual direction simply being, say, the priest at their local parish, that may not be the go-to person, right? Because it's not necessarily that the priest may be available for that, or even willing or trained to do that. So it's still a very ambiguous idea and concept, I think, out there. And I think that the survey does kind of show that. I mean, I'm always kind of curious as to really what people were thinking in their head when they were doing the survey, whether they think that spiritual direction is just simply seeking counsel, like a one-off type of moment with a priest or someone who they think is connected to the church in a professional way. So this is like something that I think is a very interesting topic, because it's so foundational to just the life of being a Christian, to be in companionship with someone as we work on accountability and things like that. So I think it's interesting to really try to understand better, using the statistics, what people may really have been thinking when they said what they said. So that's what I would just like to kind of begin with.
Yeah. So thinking about online spiritual direction, that's right up your alley, right, Greg? Can you speak to kind of how that works?
Well, I guess it all depends on what you mean by online. So we do pastoral counseling both via the telephone and via Zoom. And so that would be our version of online, as opposed to, say, text-based work, say something like, like a DocSpace or a BetterHelp kind of thing. So it works very well. In fact, the research on what's called, telehealth, telecounseling, shows that in many cases it's at least as effective, if not more effective, than face-to-face work, mostly for 2 reasons. One is because it's more readily available, and because of that, you have fewer cancellations for appointments. It's just easier to access it. And then secondly, especially when we're doing the telephone work as opposed to Zoom work, video teleconferencing work, there's a kind of confession behind the screen quality to it. It's called the disinhibition effect, right? Where people are just more open and happy to dive right into subjects. I remember even when I was doing face-to-face work, even when I've been working with somebody for a period of time, there's a little bit of a dance at the beginning of every session where we're getting comfortable with each other and kind of deciding how do we get into this, what do we want to talk about? When someone comes for pastoral counseling, especially on the phone as opposed to video teleconferencing, because of the anonymity, they jump into it much more readily, and are tend to be willing to share more openly than they do face to face. And actually, the research backs that up.
Yeah, that makes sense. By the way, can you just help define for us, pastoral counseling versus spiritual direction, just to make sure we all
Sure. So,
understand?
in broad strokes, and I'd actually be interested in Father Boniface's input on this too. But so where spiritual direction focuses primarily on experiencing God in the moment, whatever your experience is, how can I encounter God more meaningfully? How can I build more of a relationship with Him? How can I discern His will for my life? Pastoral counseling touches on all those subjects, but focuses on making change and building skills. So, where the spiritual director is less concerned with that aspect of it, building skills and making change, the spiritual director is focusing more on encountering God in the moment that we're in, and how do we respond to the movement of the Holy Spirit in that moment.
Is that the same definition you'd be working from as well, Father Boniface?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of interesting things that emerge. If I can take a little vector into that question from the starting point of what the statistics are saying to us, an interesting contrast would be with the number of people who would have answered what the answers would have been, say, 60 years ago, which would have been essentially zero people were in spiritual direction. And so I think there's something to acknowledge that there's a massive shift in this realm. I wonder, Greg probably knows better what those statistics would have been for counseling, but certainly very few people would have been in counseling 60 years ago, I think, compared to the number of people today. So I think that's a whole interesting trend to acknowledge, and I think is in part because of the breakdown of relationships, of culture, of society, what we might have had in families and friends, which I would have said is a lower level of attending to the person and understanding of the heart. Um, there's a commitment in the relationship, but not to the same level of sort of intimacy and interiority. And in the general breakdown in relationships, which would have supported us more basically in terms of our, I think, emotional growth, spiritual growth in society and parishes and families, we've had this massive emergence of specialists. So, and to an advantage, this is where when something is lost, God gives us more than we had before. I think that principle is at work here. But then to come into that realm of the kind of specialists in mental health counseling or the specialists in pastoral counseling, I guess I would think it tends to be a little bit more goal oriented. Sometimes, there's obviously a range from positive psychology to maybe more problem focused, and those dimensions in counseling. But I do think also just the identity of the counselor versus the identity of the spiritual director and the nature of the relationship makes a difference. I think someone could say the same thing in counseling that they say in spiritual direction, but the effect is different because the spiritual director is associated with my relationship with God. And so there's a level of healing and transformation that takes place at that level, my relationship with God, that wouldn't be as direct. So the transference is a little bit more direct there between spiritual direction and God than between counseling and God, I guess I would propose. So just the
Right.
nature of the relationship makes a difference. And then I think some of the focus may be goal focused as opposed to, I certainly promote spiritual direction as a lifelong, potentially lifelong relationship. So.
Right. Right.
The one
You
thing
make a
I'll
great.
add to your sorry, but the one thing I would add to your comment about how common spiritual direction might have been, I think, in addition to what you're saying, which is all true, um, you know, prior to the Second Vatican Council, spiritual direction wasn't that lay people were forbidden to participate in it, but they weren't really encouraged to. spiritual direction was really something that was targeted at priests and religious. And it wasn't really until the universal call to holiness that people really started looking at how the laity could take advantage of spiritual direction. And so it's still a relatively new idea for lay people to pursue spiritual direction. And in fact, in various points when I've sought spiritual direction, I've had pastors say, well, why do you really need that as a lay person? If you're participating in the sacraments and you have a regular prayer life, why do you really need that? And so I think there's still a lot of misunderstanding about why lay people would even want it, versus, in addition to what they would get out of it, or why they would need it. So I think that there's some education that needs to happen on that front as well.
Took the words
And
out
I
of my
would say,
mouth.
actually,
Sorry, go ahead, Father.
sorry, just even in terms of priests and religious, they mostly weren't receiving spiritual direction either before the council. A spiritual director in a seminary met with all the seminarians once at the beginning of the year and once at the end of the year. I mean, it wasn't spiritual direction in the way that we would understand it now. Spiritual direction was much more specialized and yeah, sort of specifically applied. So the general idea that a lot of people would have, and Pope Francis has coined this word accompaniment to make it an even sort of more easily understandable, accessible idea that I'm sharing my interior life, really, ultimately my prayer life, my relationship with God, but other aspects of my interior life with someone at a deep level, in a consistent way.
Is it the case that even religious would not have had ongoing spiritual direction? Prior.
It's still the case now. I mean, if you ask the average religious sister, they're not receiving spiritual direction. Most of them. I mean, it's still rare in that space. Seminarians are required to receive spiritual direction. That's about the only space that I'm aware of that it's mandated in any way. And then that has extended into the priesthood, and it's kind of flowed out a bit more. But yeah, religious. So the examples we hear are often religious, Saint Faustina or something like that. But she acknowledges that the grace of a spiritual director is a rare gift, and she thanks God and for that gift. So again, that's an older. I do think it's a real gift of our time. One of the Second Vatican Council wasn't thematic about bringing forth spiritual direction, but I do think there was a turning point there, encouraging the apostolate of the laity, which has led to more lay spiritual directors, and then certainly, like Greg said, the universal call to holiness, encouraging everybody that a life of deep prayer and is really possible. And then how do I share that with somebody who can help me to grow in that becomes a question and a need.
What do you guys see as? Yeah, please.
No, I was just gonna say, it's kind of interesting hearing all this, because I feel like in some ways our times have recaptured some part of the tradition that has just gone by the wayside. I mean, at De Sales Media, we're inspired by Francis de Sales, who I think was, so ahead of the time, ahead of the curve in promoting spiritual direction in so many different ways. And the whole notion of the universal call of holiness, the introduction to devout life, I think is a precursor to that. So, it's embedded in the tradition in different ways. It's just neat how it's a little bit more, I guess you would say, mainstreamed, even though maybe that's a very strong word to use in this case, but clearly something that is talked about more frequently. But, even in the very beginning, I mean, I think that we look at some of the very beginning of Christianity. I mean, I would say, like, the conversion of Paul was really brought about and processed through, Ananias. So, like, he was a real spiritual guide, spiritual director. So, like, it's throughout the history of the church that we see this showing up, and it's kind of neat, as both you said, that at our time now, it's becoming just a little bit more normative, even though it may not fully be understood. The one thing I just want to throw in here too is that spiritual direction is so much dependent upon the person seeking it too. So, while you may be so contracted with, say, a therapist to because you're paying the person and whatnot, spiritual direction doesn't seem to always have that. So it's at least for my directees, I put the ball in their court to be able to say, okay, well, you're going to have to determine how frequently we're going to meet, because it doesn't seem to be always the best practice for me to kind of be telling people when to meet. So I don't know if that plays a role here too, because it's something that is a little ambiguous on the frequency or how that should be organized. So actually, I'm just really curious for both of you, Father and Greg, like, how do you look at that as being part of the other part of spiritual direction that maybe is not well understood?
Yeah, well, I think that there are, in terms of best practices and standards, you know, maybe a place that spiritual direction has persisted more consistently throughout the tradition is in the Christian East, and the concept of a spiritual father, a spiritual mother has been much more a part of that. But in that context too, they sort of parallel your spiritual heritage. You know, there's apostolic succession on the one hand, there's like your spiritual parentage, or that line on the other hand. We tend to talk about spiritualities and charisms, Franciscan, Dominican, these kinds of things. But the point is, in terms of some of those best practices, standards, cultural applications, that tends to be a bit various, as you know, somebody's line of spiritual directors may have established some kind of expectation. I think people often draw a lot from, if they've been formed in a particular school, then those schools have set some standards. But yeah, I don't think so. I'm actually in communication with several people trying to establish a professional association of Catholic spiritual directors now. And some of those things may have a chance to kind of come together and coalesce and mutually inform. But yeah, I think there's I think there's a variety, and probably a legitimate variety, around those kinds of, you know, how often. I generally say an hour once a month is a good kind of baseline. We have to meet with seminarians twice a month as per the program for priestly formation. Sometimes a situation requires more, or can allow for less. So.
Well, and kind of building on some of the differences we were identifying between spiritual direction and pastoral counseling, I think that this is another example of that. So, because pastoral counseling, for instance, is focused more on, well, like you were saying, Father Boniface, it's more goal focused, it's more oriented toward change and skill building. You know, we would meet with our clients at least weekly, sometimes more, mostly weekly. But because there are specific things that we're teaching and specific goals that we're trying to achieve, and once those goals are achieved, the relationship will end, or at least pause. Whereas with spiritual direction, like you were saying, the idea is creating ideally a lifelong process of accompaniment. And kind of a longer term relationship on reflecting how I can encounter God in my daily life, and that's a lifelong process.
Mm-hmm. There's been a couple interesting questions here that I actually want to bring up now. I think they're relevant for us. Someone was asking about, you know, when people are when a spiritual director is a lay person, you know, what they wonder about their background. And you know, obviously we have a diocesan priest who's a spiritual director here, a religious priest who's a spiritual director, and Greg, a lay person who has also done spiritual direction. So I mean, do you guys feel like there's more legitimacy one way or the other? By the way, my own spiritual director is a lay person, so I have experience in that area. Not that I am one. But what do you guys think about that?
So the Pope Francis has made a pretty strong case. I don't even want to say case. He has simply asserted, according to the tradition, that spiritual direction is not a charism that is connected to holy orders. So you don't need holy orders to be a spiritual director, and that goes back to the beginning. The original spiritual directors, who were roughly you know, the desert fathers, the monastic fathers, were not ordained, and those initial examples show us that the charism of spiritual direction travels a little bit differently. I do think one of the dimensions of spiritual direction is that the person is really connected to the church and a kind of representative of the church. And the sort of classic text by Barry and Connolly on spiritual direction talks about every Christian, like the Acts of the Apostles, every Christian giving testimony to their faith to the church. Like, how does that happen? Well, not like during Mass. So we give testimony to a representative. Well, who would that be? Well, that actually fits into spiritual direction, but then some sense that the spiritual director would be really associated with the church. And I think that may get at this idea. People sort of have a little hesitation around lay people, but I think that gets alleviated when there's that connection with the church. Either the recommendation of the pastor or the bishop seems to alleviate some of that. And then we tie that together with, I run an institute that forms spiritual directors. We have a spiritual direction formation program. And, we put that in front of the bishops and said, well, if they were formed in this way, would you support them in spiritual direction? And so then those are sort of layers of trust that get elaborated from that. But I think we also have the sense in our parish, there's like the holy person that we've seen because we go to Mass and they go to Mass and they volunteer at a lot of things and they have a lot of good things to say. And then we kind of organically open up and trust that this is somebody who's like really kind of a representative of the church and somebody who can really receive my testimony of faith. And then again, programs and certifications and things help to fortify our trust in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
great.
and it's nice to see that there are. I apologize, Dave. It's nice to see that there are more training programs available for spiritual directors. I know, locally in Steubenville, so the Princeton University has a program, but that's not certainly the only school that does. And I'm also familiar with sort of extra academic, if you want to call it, programs. For example, I'm aware. I know it doesn't originate there, but there's an outfit that works with the Archdiocese of Kansas City that's doing a lot to train spiritual accompaniment and spiritual mentors and spiritual directors, and giving lay people access to that. So there are a lot of different creative movements to train lay people in being able to provide quality spiritual direction.
Yeah. Greg, someone wants to know, what is the difference between pastoral counseling, mental health counseling, pastoral counseling versus spiritual direction? We covered this a little bit, but do you want to go a little bit deeper there?
Yeah, if you don't mind. I mean, we're going to use a couple of different terms here, so just to help understand. So the first level would be what you might hear as Christian counseling, which is basically usually a licensed mental health provider who is offering some kind of faith flavored advice. They don't necessarily have any training in integrating faith and counseling, but they're faithful in some way, and they have their own way of integrating those things. So that would be what your Christian counseling. Yeah. The next level would be what's called spiritually integrated psychotherapy. And so there's an organization. It's actually the organization that accredits chaplains. It's the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education. And they accredit chaplains, but they also merged with the Association for Pastoral Counseling. And so they now have a certificate for what's called spiritually integrated psychotherapy, which is a systematic way to integrate faith and clinical practice. So they certify people in spiritually integrated psychotherapy, and I'm certified, for example, as a trainer in spiritually integrated psychotherapy as well. So there's an effective and ethical way to integrate, our faith tradition with clinical practice. And so if you have somebody who's kind of practicing on their own, who's received that training, they would be a spiritually integrated psychotherapist. What a pastoral counselor is beyond that, though, is that's somebody who does have a formal relationship with the church. So, for example, Catholic counselors is recognized by the USCCB as a ministry of the church, and we serve under the Bishop of Steubenville, who we're responsible to for the fidelity of our work. And secondly, and we do have, in addition to the certification from the ACPE, additional training in pastoral theology. And our goal, so where a mental health counselor is focused on reducing specific symptoms of mental health disorders, we're interested certainly in helping people of faith respond to problems, but our ultimate goal is to help them respond to those things as a Christian disciple would. So our focus is really on how do we apply psychological and spiritual tools to help people be more effective missionary disciples in the face of the problems they're encountering, which will also reduce symptoms. But the main focus is really that idea of discipleship. So those are some distinctions.
So from a practical perspective, if I'm just a lay person who's maybe watching right now or interested in this stuff, and they're trying to decide, I don't know, I'm not sure if I need, some form of counseling that you just mentioned, or a spiritual director. Like, how would someone go about discerning that? And that could be for Greg or for anyone.
They do different things. So I mean, we often encourage the people that we work with to have a spiritual director if you know if you know if that seems reasonable. And you know, and not everybody who's in spiritual direction needs counseling, but I would say that everybody who's doing our pastoral counseling could benefit from spiritual direction as well. Because again, our focus is on making change and having more of a time limited relationship, whereas a spiritual director is focused more on encountering God wherever you're at, and that being more of a lifelong relationship.
Yeah, I would agree. I find I love it when I have directees who are also getting some counseling. I've learned a lot of counseling secondhand through my directees. So what are you working on in counseling? What does your psychologist have to say about that? But I find also, as I mentioned, reasonably speaking, an hour once a month is a kind of standard pacing for spiritual direction, and I can't provide at this point much more than that for people, but sometimes people really need that as issues may arise even in spiritual direction, encouraging them to receive counseling where they can really focus in on maybe a particular issue, something in their past that's coming up, some relational difficulty that's really coming to light, that they can focus on that in counseling for a number of even months, weekly. Somebody asked about paying spiritual directors, so I never charge directees, but there is a value to payment that it does motivate people to do work at times, and the fact that they're paying that counselor can also kind of push the things a little bit deeper. But but the spiritual director with that lifelong relationship does a lot of integrating. So the things that they go off and maybe work on in counseling then get integrated back into their relationship with God through spiritual direction. Maybe they go off to a retreat, have some experience that gets integrated back in spiritual direction. They move forward in their life and getting married, having children, that gets integrated back in spiritual direction. So that lifelong kind of steady pacing of spiritual direction can be a real powerful integrating factor.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and once again, with the overlap between, so I think pastoral counseling involves some degree of spiritual direction light. You know, where we're looking at, you know, are you participating in the sacraments? What's your relationship with God like? There's a wonderful book by Ken Pargament called Spiritually Integrated Psychotherapy that talks about, you know, what unhealthy spirituality looks like versus healthy spirituality, and helps to identify um, the different types of spiritual practices that exist, and are you taking advantage of those spiritual practices? How could you use those for more effective coping and change and those kinds of things? So there's an element of spiritual direction in pastoral counseling, but again, it's more goal oriented than traditional spiritual direction would be.
The questions are flowing in, so I'm just going to keep going here. I think this is this is great. I'm going to ask one more question from the perspective of like the directee side, and then I'll ask a few about kind of potential director questions. So someone asked, how can a confessor and a spiritual director overlap? And should, when you're thinking about your confessor, like, should anything not be shared between the two? Or people have a question about kind of the difference and maybe keeping a distinction and so forth.
It's an interesting point of divergence in the tradition that the Jesuit approach, which then also pervaded a lot of seminary formation for decades, was that they be kept separate. And you'll see that show up in Pope Francis a little bit too, as he's not trying to keep them separate, but just acknowledging, for example, with sisters, they may have a confessor, but maybe someone in their own community could serve as a spiritual director. Confession is obviously specifically focused on sin. I mean, the matter for confession is sin. It's a liturgy around confessing sin and receiving absolution. So it's a ritualized form of what and can be in a very specific way. The sins don't need to be deeply elaborated and explained and understood. All of the insight doesn't need to come out in confession. Uh, that could be done entirely in spiritual direction. So I also do a lot of online spiritual direction. Otherwise, when I'm in person, I hear my own directees' confessions. But a lot of the work around what the sin is, where the heart is, where those sorts of things could be worked out in spiritual direction. But then ritualizing that, bringing that into the liturgy of confession to receive absolution to bring before the church in that way would be sort of a different thing. Now, for somebody who has a regular confessor who is also able to kind of open the heart and receive that a little bit more, there can be a rich interaction similar to what we were talking about in kind of counseling and spiritual direction, that maybe the confessor brings some insight or asks some question and that introduces it into the conversation. It would really be then for the person to integrate those things into spiritual direction, bringing them up. I would say everything should be brought into spiritual direction as a basic rule. Obviously, confession is primarily focused on sin.
Let's switch gears and talk about kind of from the perspective of someone who either might be interested in spiritual direction or that kind of thing. So let me see what's a good one to start with. I guess someone's just wondering, if maybe first of all, how do you discern the call to be a spiritual director?
Well, we always say, what related to what's necessary to become a spiritual director, one should have a spiritual life and one should have a spiritual director. And your spiritual director should think it's a good idea for you to give spiritual direction. I would say that's kind of the basic foundation. And that can be reinforced by people asking you. Maybe you find that you're the sort of person that people open up to. Maybe they're asking explicitly, would you be my spiritual director? Could we talk more about my faith life? Do you have time for me to share with you? So Sherry Waddell gives these three, qualities of discernment: feelings, feedback, and fruitfulness. So what does it feel like to listen to someone, to receive their heart? Is that really fulfilling for you? What's the feedback people are giving you? They say, wow, you're a great listener. You're really trustworthy. I feel really safe with you. I can open my heart with you. And then what's the fruitfulness? What's coming forth in someone's life as this is just happening in checkout lines or in church narthexes or something like that? And those are signs that, well, maybe this is something that you should pursue a little bit more deeply.
I think, I'll just throw this out too. I mean, and this is just really, I think what you said is probably the best answer to this. As I'm just kind of coloring in a little bit more, but if you kind of look at the classic breakdown of the spiritual walk in the purgative and illuminative and unitive ways, that in your own personal life, as you're reflecting on where you're at spiritually, you want to make sure that you're in a place where you've been able to cooperate with grace effectively to master most of your besetting sins, to you're in that more illuminative stage of the spiritual walk where the fruit of that is really wisdom, and the idea of being able to integrate spiritual principles with everyday life in a way that's workable and livable, as opposed to just being knowledgeable about the faith and can tell people what the faith says, but not necessarily have that wisdom for what it means to live it out gracefully, if that makes sense.
A couple of questions about where can people go to become spiritual directors? Simply, where can I go to school to become one? Another person is asking specifically about kind of campus ministry. Is there a way to do it that's maybe like a boot camp or something? This person doesn't feel like they have a lot of time for training. How does one become a spiritual director?
Yeah, there certainly are a number of schools, and they all have kind of their own qualities. As Greg mentioned, at Franciscan University, they have a program, and I would see Franciscan University and Heart of Christ and Avila, both kind of following from the Clearwater, whatever that is, Our Lady of Divine Providence in Clearwater, Florida. They're all sort of flowing from that tradition of spiritual direction. There's another school, the Alleluia School in Savannah, Georgia, is great. So our Institute for Ministry Formation has a program that, so those other programs I would say are a little bit sort of like charismatic Jesuit flavored maybe, and our program would be a little bit more Benedictine monastic, I suppose. And then the Lantieri Center in Denver, the Oblates of the Virgin Mary, would be a very strongly Jesuit Ignatian program. And there's Divine Mercy University, of course, coming out of their School of Psychological Sciences has a program that would have some particularly strong psychological elements from their school. Some programs tend to be a little bit more academic. Some are maybe a little bit more, well, everything is going to be practical, but some are going to be, I suppose, less academic. Some are online, some are in person, some are cohort based. So anyway, there's a variety of differences that emerge as you start to look into that world. I'm not sure if you know other schools, but I don't mean to monopolize the list there.
No, I think you're in better position to identify those programs. But the only thing I would add to it is, I think that spiritual direction or being a spiritual director really does. I mean, obviously, you need to know what you're doing. You have to have a foundation of knowledge, right? But it's also much more who you are, and what your spiritual relationship like, and where you are in that spiritual journey. So yes, getting that academic preparation or this certification is important so that you can have those professional qualifications. But I would say that just because somebody has that, diploma on the wall, you don't want to assume anything necessarily. And really what you were saying before about, having a spiritual director that says, this might be something that you'd be good at is a really important part of that qualification process, regardless of what degree or academic training you might have.
Yeah, and the programs would be formative. Certainly all the ones that I mentioned have a practicum. All of them require you to have a spiritual director. They're all intending to lead people. So requiring a directed retreat, for example, the programs themselves are meant to progress people along the spiritual journey and get them to a place. You said it very well, Greg. It's about who you are, and the programs would help to develop that as well.
I think this also brings up the complexity too, that since there are so many different schools of training and different approaches to spiritual direction, just because you find someone who is a official, let's say, spiritual director, doesn't mean like, okay, this is the right fit for the directee. So there's all this discernment that goes into just trying to be open to spiritual direction, approaching a spiritual director, and then it continues with whether this person is actually the right fit. I mean, that's a whole other thing, because if it's not the right fit for whatever reason, then it could be kind of somehow actually hurting the spiritual growth of the person in some way. I mean, I've had to deal with lots of different types of damage control, so to speak, with certain directees who were led by another director, and you just start listening to that and like, wow, that's there's a lot of undoing. It seems like you have to kind of walk through. So I don't know if that's also something that maybe you could talk about as well. I mean, when you encounter someone who seeks you out, is there a discernment process that you walk with them to see if this is a good fit, so to speak?
This might overflow into the red flags question up there of unethical and spiritually abusive spiritual directors. I mean, I find that some kind of foundational qualities of knowing how to receive the person, receive the heart, create a secure environment in which someone can really reveal, be more vulnerable, and that there's a lot of trust that can develop. So a lot of different things can interfere with trust, which are not the fault of the spiritual director. Some people may have a harder time opening up to men or to priests or to women or whatever. Obviously, so if you can't trust the person enough to open up to them, that's going to be a bad fit. If the person is, the spiritual director is ill-equipped in certain ways, and it's true too. I mean, there is transference and countertransference. Directees' defenses can hit directors' woundedness and raise up defenses, and there can be certain kinds of clashes that can emerge, and one would want to be just honest and sensitive about those sorts of things. Again, directors should be getting their own spiritual direction and or supervision to work through some of those issues as well. But yeah, I guess I would see fit a little bit more in those spaces than sort of schools of spirituality. I think that would be a little bit more secondary, but some approaches to spiritual direction have focused more exclusively on like your prayer And that could be more limiting than somebody is looking for, where they really want to integrate more of their whole interior into their relationship with God and do that through spiritual direction. So there could be some elements there in terms of spirituality that would be uh, worth paying attention to as well.
So there's red flags that you would want to kind of be aware of in any case. And then there's also the kind of fit aspect of like, is this, helping you in the way that you would like to be helped? That's great. All right. I want to get back over to the data for a minute. These questions have been great. Thank you so much for asking so many good ones. But to get back to some of the findings that we had. So I showed you so far some of the findings that we revealed in our overall report a couple of years ago. These next ones are brand new based on a couple of other questions that I had looking at the data, which was around, can we notice? So this first question I had was, can we notice where just because someone goes to mass every Sunday doesn't mean that they have a really robust spiritual life, and so, or a faith life. I'm trying to get away from saying that term spiritual life because we're talking about integrated lives, right? So kind of where are they in their path as a disciple? And then the second question is, are there correlations between questions that we can make? And so I don't want to get too deep into this just because we are so late in the webinar already. But so we learned about kind of these segments. If you want to learn more about this, again, I will refer you to the first webinar where we talk kind of about this in depth. But basically, we've discovered that there are kind of 5 segments among the mass attending Catholics we studied, and those furthest along are kind of these strong. So every one of these circles is a different respondent measuring on kind of their own like reported strength in discipleship and need for growth in discipleship. And so looking at those different segments, what we found is that spiritual direction is much less likely among the 2 weak segments. So weak complacent, weak aspiring, only 12 and 14% respectively are currently receiving spiritual direction. Compare that to those who report a strong faith in these many different aspects of the discipleship that we asked about. Nearly a third of them are currently receiving, and only a third have never received in both cases. So clearly there's a correlation there. Similarly, we asked about the likelihood of receiving spiritual direction online. And actually, what was nice to see, the weak and strong aspiring were most likely. So I think it kind of makes sense. They're aspiring to improve in general in discipleship, and so they're open to different ways, including online spiritual direction. We asked about this in the third poll. Nick, could we see those results from our attendees, please? Thank you. So, okay. We knew that most people, well, a good percentage had already already had spiritual directors. So, of those who already have a spiritual director, it looks like 20% were said that they have an in-person one, and 13% said that they have an online one. So, not too many fewer do online already, and it looks like most people are saying that they would be somewhat or extremely likely to sign up for online spiritual direction if it was available to them. And that's kind of what we see in general from the data, is that people are when it's available, people do it. So a few more correlations I'll share before we close here. People currently receiving spiritual direction were far more likely, or at least a fair bit more likely, to pray every day of the week. Those who never receive spiritual direction are far more likely to pray only 1 to 2 days per week when they pray, and to only pray less than 15 minutes at a time when they pray, rather than the hour plus that we see from those who have more experience with spiritual direction. When it comes to group involvement with faith groups, those currently receiving spiritual direction are far more likely to find involvement in a social or community group that is faith-oriented. I know I'm moving quickly here, but I just want to highlight a few things. When it comes to comfort and faith sharing, those who are who have never received spiritual direction are far more likely to be middling or uncomfortable when it comes to sharing their faith. And sure enough, they're not doing it either. So proactivity and faith sharing only those who have never received spiritual direction much more likely to not be proactive in sharing their faith. Finally, I just want to share one more finding. Those who used to have a spiritual director, those who have received it in the past, only 40% of them said that spiritual direction is available in their home parish or faith community to which they belong. Still a lot more than those who have never received it. So it kind of goes to show that those who have never received it, a full 64% of them don't know if it's available. And what was really wild was that 100% of those currently receiving spiritual direction reported that that it is available in their home parish or faith community. That made Father John and I kind of wonder, like, do people really understand what we're talking about here when we say spiritual direction? Admittedly, our definition in the survey was a little less robust than the one that we had presented earlier. We had said spiritual direction is the process by which you can ask someone, usually a priest, deacon, or other religious, to guide you in your faith journey and your prayer life. So it's possible some people didn't quite know what we meant, but honestly, the fact that so many identified as used to being spiritual direction and no longer makes me think maybe they have done it. The other thing, Father John, that I remember you saying when you saw this slide was, man, where are these people? Where are these faith communities that this is all happening? And, I know it's a little bit rhetorical, but kind of not. This is where respondents came from. As you can see, just pretty good distribution across the U.S. So we're Denver's probably a little more overrepresented because of the Archdiocese of Denver's participation in this. But yeah, I mean, so pausing here again, what do you guys think of all this?
Well, the last slide is indicating that they knew it was available because they're receiving it. So they're actually receiving
specifically
it. So
available.
therefore it's available.
Yeah. And maybe wherever. I mean, I would say that the one that my spiritual director is not in my my parish or in a faith community to which I belong. It's outside of that. So that's why I was a little bit surprised. I felt like I had to go outside of my community to find one. And I thought that might be more of a common scenario.
Yeah, the question was kind of really ordered towards, like, is it available like in your local parish community?
Yeah, available in your home parish or any faith community to which you belong. That's why I was a little surprised at the results here. In any case, man, it is nearly time to go. I wanted to have more time for questions. I want to have more time for this, for just more insights. But honestly, I also just want to get people out of here on time. I want to be mindful of that. So let me just skip ahead here. Apologize for if we didn't get to your question. I hope we did get to a whole bunch. So hopefully people felt responded to. This is the second in a series of 6 webinars. So here are the upcoming ones, all about technology, growth in faith, community, generational differences. There's all kind of good stuff coming up. It's every other Monday at 1 p.m. Eastern. And so yeah, that's this is going to do it for us today on the Religion to Reality webinar. Thank you for joining. All of those can be signed up for at religiontoreality.org. So please check that out if you can sign up for more of them, or you can go there to see the recordings and download the slides from this one. And finally, we'd love your feedback. You'll see a survey when the webinar ends. So we'd really love to hear from you and understand what we did right, what we could improve on. Your feedback really matters to us. Thank you for joining us and have a great day.